please welcome Julie Clark, presenting Lighthouses of Humboldt County. Thanks for joining us, Julie, and please tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work with the Bureau of Land Management, and your passion for lighthouses. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Justin. Can everyone hear me? Good. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so professional. I'm so impressed with your whole opening and what you have to offer as far as doing this virtually. I was challenged a little bit today in that hopefully you guys can see my screen as soon as I'm gonna share this. I hope everyone can see it. The Lighthouses of Humboldt County, I'm going to present to you today. I was a little disheveled. I went home and I was going to sit in my nice cozy house and do this presentation, and I had changed my password earlier today at work, and sometimes it doesn't line up perfectly, and so I couldn't even get on my computer, so I had to come back to work. So I'm sitting in the office here with no one here, but it's nice and quiet, and I'm just honored to do this. I did want to talk about this book a little bit. This is what my slideshow is based on. It's Images of America, Lighthouses of Humboldt County. Looks like this. Sorry, it might be a little blurry. Anyway, you guys have probably all seen the sepia toned books. You can get them all over, at Eureka Books, Clark Museum. I've even seen them in, I saw one in Rite Aid in McKinleyville not too long ago. So the books are there, and if I see you, I will definitely sign. Hopefully some of you can get a chance to read that. It's a great resource in our area. And the reason why I wrote it really was because all the areas where the lighthouses are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to also write the Falk book, which is the company town of Falk where I work in Headwaters Forest. And so I was able to collect all these photographs and do stories and things like that. So I kind of had a sense for it. And then once we got the Trinidad Head Lighthouse, I thought there was a real need to get this information out to the public in a cohesive way. So I worked all winter a couple of years ago, actually, in Elko, and put this together, the book. And then the slideshow, I'm offering it as a counterpart. So we're going to talk, this is a photo of the Trinidad Head Lighthouse. This is Fred Harrington. You can see him there with his wife, Maud Harrington. Or sorry, his daughter Maud, little son Fred, and his wife Josephine Harrington, which I play sometimes. I do living history out at Trinidad Head Lighthouse. So we have a big railing around this rock area here. This was definitely not OSHA approved in this time period in the early 1900s. Fred came in 1918, so this was probably right around that time. So the Trinidad Head is it's a gateway to the California Coastal National Monument, which is 20,000 rocks and islands, exposed reefs, which goes all the way down to the tip of California south. And are comprised about 8,000 acres of public land. So we have Trinidad Head, Wallop Lighthouse Ranch, which is out at the South Spit, Lost Coast Headlands, Point Arena, Stornetto, Catoni Coast Dairies, and Piedras Blancas. And we, as a BLM, manage all those areas. So they're important breeding grounds for seabirds, and they're monitored quite frequently. And there's plenty of habitat for all those seabirds. So they're very critical to our coastline. And like I said, the gateway in this area is Lost Coast Headlands and then Lighthouse Ranch. Trinidad Heads. Very important area. So I want to ask, how many lighthouses in Humboldt County? Just kind of keep that in your head. How many lighthouses do you think there are in Humboldt County? Where are the lighthouses in Humboldt County? So that's another question I've asked a lot of people. And you guys will probably have a different answer because you're in Southern Humboldt, many of you. Because you've seen Cape Mendocino Lighthouse and you've seen Punta Gorda, some of you. But up here, people tend to think of St. George Reef near Crescent City as one of our lighthouses in Humboldt County, which is not. And they also, because they saw this so often in Trinidad, when they were rounding the corner, saw that beautiful view, the Trinidad Memorial Lighthouse in Trinidad, which was never operational. It's a memorial lighthouse. So it's where all the, it's a memorial where all the lost at sea names are dedicated there. So I'll talk a little bit about that. It's been moved recently in the last few years, but those are not actually the lighthouses. So here we go. We have Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse in the left-hand corner, which was kind of an interesting place out at Samoa Peninsula. And that was built in 1855, just after California became a state. Then we have Cape Mendocino in 1868, Trinidad Head in 1871. Table Bluff in 1892, which kind of replaced the Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse. And then Punta Gorda in 1911, and then the Trinidad Memorial Lighthouse for all that was lost at sea was built in 1949 by the Civic Club in Trinidad. I'm going to talk all about these 5 lighthouses today. I kind of, when I talk about them, I kind of liken them to traffic lights. When there are accidents and there's deaths, there's money in those intersections to put up traffic lights, stop signs, that sort of thing. Well, that's kind of how we got money and funding for a lot of our lighthouses up and down the coast because there were so many shipwrecks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse. That was our first lighthouse. And it was in 1855, but it had a long journey and, I mean, extremely long journey. So all the supplies that were meant to come here to build Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse were lost at sea. So I'm going to talk about that. And then the light was kind of transferred. So I'll talk about that. So it had a precarious beginning. Cape Mendocino was very interesting when I studied that, just because where it sits, if you've ever been out there, it's very steep, very windy area that we have here in, especially right there near the reef there. I mean, it's incredibly windy that the lighthouse keepers would be running from their from the light to their lighthouse constantly and in and out of that wind. It was a very hard place to live. It was called the Alcatraz, actually, of lighthouses because nobody wanted to be there. And then we have the Trinidad Head Lighthouse, which is still the only operational lighthouse up until now that's still managed by the Coast Guard, the light itself. And then we manage the light, the structure, and have guided tours there. And then the Table Bluff Lighthouse was replaced the Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse up near the South Spit. And then, of course, the Punta Gorda Lighthouse is still there. Of course, it's not operational, but it's a great hike. I'm sure some of you have been down to see that. The Trinidad Memorial Lighthouse was moved in 2018. It's managed by the Trinidad Civic Club. It was actually falling down the cliff. There with it was sort of an unstable slope, so they decided to move it down where the Trinidad Rancheria is, and it's near the seascape in that parking lot there. On the right, you'll see the photo of what they want to build sort of like a foundation. Right now, it's just kind of sitting on the ground. So they're going to kind of build a little park there that people can formally look at it as an interpretive site. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our rocky beginnings. We are in the Pacific coast, one of the most dangerous, windswept, rocky coasts all along the coast here. And I talked about it in my book. Cold Pacific currents, powerful Alaska winter storms that we've seen lately, towering offshore rocks, fog, and dangerous harbor entrance bars consistently threatening seafaring captains that came near this impenetrable coast. In 1852, the U.S. Lighthouse Board was created by the U.S. Department of Treasury, and they were allocated $148,000 to build 16 lighthouses along the western seaboard. So that's not very much money in our dollars, of course, but I guess it was a lot back then because that's a lot of lighthouses for $148,000. I was astonished to get that figure. So you can guess why a lot of the Spanish ships during the 16th century would just cruise on by here. They did not really port in our area. And the reason why they were coming here, because of the trade route from Manila to Acapulco, Mexico. So you can see the map on my next slide. So they would actually come to Manila from Acapulco and then make the round trip and make this trip all the way around with spices and things like that and trading down to Acapulco, Mexico. And they would kind of come by Cape Mendocino during that time and then just go south. And of course, they never ported because of the dangerous conditions along the coast. And so they would just come right by. So it wasn't really until the gold rush that, sort of the discovery of our coast happened. And it was no wonder in 1849 that San Francisco exploded from about 20,000 people. So it had 1,000 people in 1848 to 25,000 people overnight. Basically, like in 1 year. So in 1849, it grew to 25,000 people from 1,000. And so a lot of the people that moved to San Francisco during that time were merchants that were selling supplies to the gold miners. That's who really made the money. It wasn't the miners themselves. They were just working out in the gold mines and getting what they could get. I mean, some did get rich, but it was like Levi Strauss. I mean, it was all the people that were selling the tools, equipment, clothing, everything that the miners needed. And so at exorbitant prices. And so the idea was these merchants in Weaverville they had the same idea in 1850 to come to our coast here in Humboldt Bay. There was rumor that there was a bay for many, many years. There was no ships that came into our bay because it was really undiscovered during that time. Undiscovered, I'm doing quotation marks from European explorers and American. So they would come, the Gregg Party in 1852, or 1850, I'm sorry, came to Humboldt Bay by foot, and they thought it was only going to take 10 days, and it turned into 40 days. And they came out by foot from Weaverville. There was about 10 of them. And because they thought it would be only 10 days, they only brought 10 days worth of food. And so by the time they got to the area of the Mad River, they were completely starving. They got into a huge fight and actually named the Mad River from this huge fight that they had. Then they went south and found the opening of Humboldt Bay, and then raced to San Francisco to tell everybody. So that was Josiah Gregg and L.K. Wood. So you probably have heard that name if you've ever been to Humboldt State or Cal Poly Humboldt, because it was named after him. So on the way to Humboldt Bay, they camp in what is now the Crabs baseball field in Arcata, and they meet with Kiwalta, the Wiyot chief. And this painting is hanging in the Clark Museum, and they trade some clams and things like that. But on their trip over from Weaverville, they were eating flour with water. I mean, they were just completely starving. So they were in really bad shape when they got here, and then went south, and they actually separated. Some went east and some went west, and Josiah Gregg actually died on the way back to San Francisco. So, but keep in mind this Wiyot chief's name, Kiwalta. So in researching the book, I find a lot of neat tidbits, and this was probably the best one that I found. So I found a lot of these photographs through Humboldt State, or I keep saying Humboldt State, it's Cal Poly, the U.S. Lighthouse Society. I was able to get a lot of the photography online just because, you know, it's during COVID, and I couldn't get into any of the museums. But I was able to really kind of research this book and finding these really nice tidbits. And this one actually was done, I found this photo on Ancestry. So if you ever are on ancestry.com, and you can actually do a lot of historical research and find newspaper articles and family stories. And one of the stories was this woman, Kayakwash. And if I'm, you know, mispronouncing her name, I'm really sorry. And then her Americanized name was Josephine Beach. And the reason why I'm bringing her up, she was the daughter of Kiwalta, the Wiyot chief, and she was born pre-contact. And her son actually married one of the lighthouse keeper's daughters. So there was this really cool connection that happened when I was doing the research with the lighthouse and this Wiyot chief's daughter. She did not die in the Wiyot 1860 massacre, because on her way to the site of Indian, where the celebration, the World Renewal celebration was happening, she was turned around by the fog with her 11-month-old son. And so she went back home, and she survived the Wiyot massacre. So she's one of the only survivors. There was about 1,500 Wiyot people pre-contact when she was born. And then after the 1860 Indian Island massacre, few of them remained of her tribe. So I thought that was a really interesting story. And then because of all that research, the great-great-grandson, David Hunter, actually came out to Trinidad Lighthouse, and we met, and they had a clock that they gave the Trinidad Museum. So a lot of really neat stories came out of doing that research. Another story that I thought was really interesting when I was reading about this Captain John, who was with the Hoopa tribe. And this information came from Two Peoples, One Place by Ray Raphael, which is such a great book. And he recounted in 1870 about the morning of his birth, and pale faces showing up with knives and beads. And it was meant with excitement and wonder, but the way of life was forever altered after that. And so I just wanted to mention that. So this was Humboldt Bay in 1870. You know, like I said, I mean, this was a wild and wet coast for sure. Without our jetties leading the ships into the harbor, there was many shipwrecks. In between 1850 and 1865, there was 25 wrecks. 81 people were killed just going through the Humboldt Bar. And some of the famous ones were the Corona in 1907 and the Milwaukee in 1917. And this is all in the book as well. So a need for lighthouses was paramount on our coast. This cross is actually on our way to the Lost Coast Headlands, memorializing 108 passengers that died in 1860 that swam, and they hit Blunt's Reef, and the ship hit Blunt's Reef, and 38 of those 108 passengers drowned. So this memorializes them, this cross, and it's still there. So how did we get the first lighthouse in Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse? And the location was right next to our, what is now the North Jetty. And this was kind of an interesting placement in that this James Alden, who was a Navy lieutenant, surveyed the coast and found that in 1851 that the light should be on the North Spit nearest to the bar. Now, you know, it makes a little sense, but then he went on to add, he thought that it would be less obscured by the fog. It is so foggy there that he must have been there at a sunny period of time, and he was only here for a week. So that lighthouse was kind of doomed from the beginning of its placement in the dunes near the jetties in the fog, with a mean tide of about 50 feet where the light was above high tide. He stated that on the North Spit, nearest point to the entrance is therefore less obscured by fog. That's his exact quote. So there was a coastal survey done by him. By then there was 3 towns that were popping up: Bucksport, which is where Bucksport Sporting Goods is, Eureka, and Union, which is the former name of Arcata. So the Lighthouse Board is established in 1852, so it's formalized. And Gibson and Kelly from Baltimore get the contract to build 8 lighthouses on the West Coast. And Amy B. Young is the architect. And he basically builds them all, and they all look the same. So they're a structure with the living room and kitchen in the bottom where their living space is, and then they have a sort of a stairway in the middle of the structure that goes up into where the Fresnel lens is. So all of them had Fresnel lenses by then. The Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse looked very much like this Battery Point, and almost identical to the Point Loma Lighthouse. We don't have any new pictures of, so what I'm saying is we don't have any photographs of what the Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse looked like new. We have it all in decay, but if you look at Point Loma Lighthouse, it looks exactly like our lighthouse, except for our tower was a little bit bigger, or a little bit taller, I should say. So this is a picture of 1858 from Bucksport. So this is like where Broadway is today. And you can see, like, just way in the distance is that Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse. And this was it in its decay. So it was from 1854 to 1856 was when construction began. The Oriole, which was a bark carrying lighthouse supplies from Humboldt Harbor, wrecked at Cape Disappointment. So they were carrying all this, the lighthouse supplies for Cape Disappointment as well. And they were going north, and then they were going to come back to Eureka and build our lighthouse, but it wrecked. And so all the materials were washed away, and then they had to start all over again and come and fund it and then get it here. 1854, they finally can start construction on the Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse. This is Point Loma. So like I said, there's not a lot of difference of the way it looked, except for we extended the tower so that it would go a little bit further up above, because it was built in the sand dunes. So it was about 53 feet above high tide. So they, when the Department of Treasury started managing the Lighthouse Board in 1852, they required all lighthouses lenses to be the Fresnel, which was all shipped from France. They were about $3,000 per lens, which is about $100,000 today's money. And they were shipped from Sauter and Company in Paris. And you can guess how they got to the West Coast back then, because they had to go all the way around South America up to our coast. So it took months to get the lighthouse, to get the lights here. And then the first light was somehow whisked away by Point Loma. And our first lighthouse keeper, D.H. Pierce, quits in 1855. He's like, I'm done waiting. So it took forever to finally, after construction and then to get the light. There was just a lot of things that happened. And then finally in 1856, on the evening of December 20th, John Johnson climbed the winding stairs and he lit that light for the first time. It was a fourth Fresnel lens. So it's kind of in the mid-range of distance, that nautical miles that it would reach.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So Sarah Johnson was his wife. And 6 months later, after he had lit that, he died. So her husband died. John Johnson died. And Sarah Johnson took over the lighthouse keeping for the next 6 years. And unfortunately, once they found out that his wife was taking over, it took about a year for the Lighthouse Board to find out that indeed the Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse was being managed by a woman. They cut her pay in half. So instead of $1,000 now, she was making $600 a year. And she had 6 children. And so you can imagine the life that she led out here in this isolated area. I can go into a lot of detail, but there is a wonderful article written by Peg Wheeler in the Humboldt Historian about Sarah Johnson. And just about all the details about her life out at the North Spit. But I'll tell you, she was a hardy person. She died about 6 years after she was no longer the lighthouse keeper. She was the longest lighthouse keeper out at Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse. Many of the lighthouse keepers deserted because it was so far and so isolated. They had to actually boat across to Old Town to get supplies. She was there during the Indian Island Massacre. She was there. She heard probably what was going on. She was there when they corralled a lot of the Wiots along the North Spit there. So they had moved them from Fort Humboldt to that area. She was there through really dark times. And she stayed 6 years. So, I mean, if you ever get a chance to go out to Myrtle Grove, this is a photo of her gravesite, and she is remembered by the Coast Guard every year, and they put a lantern, which is right here, on her grave every year. Ida Lewis was another example in Newport, Rhode Island, for women lighthouse keepers. She actually won the first gold life saving medal from the United States government. She was the first woman to ever receive it in 1881 when she rescued 2 soldiers that had fallen through the ice. And her 4 years of lighthouse keeping at Lime Rock in Rhode Island Light Station, she actually saved 18 lives from drowning. So she was really tough too. So in 1878, they actually decided, okay, there's more that needs to happen here than just the light. And then they have the lighthouse saving station that's built out there. So it's not just the lighthouse keeper that has to, rescue these people from drowning when they're coming through the harbor. During the 1877 and 1882, there was 2 major earthquakes that really unstabilized the light out there. There was a flood in 1884. There was a cyclone. So it was kind of a cursed area. And then in 1885, it was permanently closed due to flooding. And they put a fog signal station in 1912 to help with the Humboldt Bar. And they moved the official lighthouse to Table Bluff. And there's a really good article about that in the Humboldt Historian, winter of 2011, from Jonathan Clark. And this photo was in it. This picture was taken in 1920 when it was in ruins. The tower collapsed in 1933, and then this cupola is out at the Maritime Museum in Samoa. So what is there now? They actually removed a bunch of this ivy. Remnants of the tower is there. Thanks to our archaeologists and some volunteers that went out there recently, and they uncovered the steps. So you can see a little bit out there, and that is out at Samoa Recreation Area managed by the BLM. And now they have these wonderful lights out at the jetty with the dolos, getting the ships in through the bar. So Table Bluff becomes the new lighthouse after the Humboldt Harbor is no longer, and it's 160 feet 5 high. They can see 14 nautical miles out to sea. Much better for the mariners to get through the bay, and they can the light actually can go all the way to the Eel River area, and it becomes a lighthouse station. So it's a little bit of more of a residence. Many assistants live there. It's much more of an operation out there, and they can have vegetable gardens, and it's a much better situation for the lighthouse keepers. And this is their view. I mean, they can see all the way into Humboldt Bay, and then all the way south into the Eel River, mouth of the Eel River. World War II really changed a lot of the makeup of the lighthouses. So they start to modernize the lights themselves. A lot of the soldiers actually moved in because they were all patrolling our coast after Pearl Harbor. And in 1941, December 20th, the only attack really on the Pacific coast, the tanker Amito was passing near Blunt's Reef off Cape Mendocino when it was torpedoed by the Japanese. And it warranted a significant response by the Coast Guard along the coast of our area in World War II. And Table Bluff became an ideal place to operate a Navy radio compasses and station, as well as Coast Guard patrolmen. So they all move in with the lighthouse keepers and become the lookouts. And the lighthouse keepers become the lookouts. And so lighthouse keeping becomes even more crucial to our coast in that area. And then large barracks were built for single men, and they were all together on Table Bluff there for a while. The last lighthouse keeper at Table Bluff was John Gonzalez, and he was eventually promoted to principal lighthouse keeper and transferred to Point Matera. And then by 1953, the Vagna signal was discontinued, and the light was replaced by an automated 3.5 Fresnel order, which eventually was shipped to the Smithsonian in 1975. And then it morphed into the Gospel Outreach and Lighthouse Ranch. And now it was many, many years that they actually had a sort of a commune out there, a Christian gospel commune, which they took over, kind of the old buildings and had vegetable gardens and started actually the Tri-City newspaper. So they were pretty influential actually during that time in Humboldt County, a big part of Humboldt County and Humboldt County history. They eventually moved the tower in the 70s, and now it's at Woodley Island Marina. And you can see that there today, which is a picture of the right. When the Bureau of Land Management came to manage it, we helped out Piedras Blancas Lighthouse, which is near San Simeon. They needed a sort of a radio tower, so we didn't need our water tower anymore in Table Bluff. So we actually shipped it south, and you can, if you go to Piedras Blancas, which I did not too long ago, I was able to see the tower from Table Bluff. And then in 2012, we removed the buildings. They're full of asbestos and things like that. So they were in bad repair, and now it is the Wallop Lighthouse Ranch area, and it's an interpretive site, all managed by the Bureau of Land Management. I encourage you to go. It's a great place to overlook the sea there. Now we'll get into Cape Mendocino Light Station, 1867. So it's right near Blunt's Reef, where a lot of shipwrecks are happening. There's actually a lightship that was on patrol there for many years. They built this. Can you imagine getting the Fresnel lens to this area, or even just the supplies to build the lighthouse itself, and to build all the structures along this beautiful coastline? I'm just amazed by the feat of work that went into building these lighthouses, and just in general, and all the lighthouses, and just the lighthouse keeping and the life there during that time. So it was on the triple junction, so it went through many structural changes, cracks. One of the lighthouses was actually lighthouse buildings was in bad repair, so they had to move in where they stored all the fuel, the kerosene, to keep the light going. And so when the inspector came to check their health and check their well-being, they were in really bad health. There was a light ship that was out on Bluff's Reef too. They're called the Swift Shore, and it served as a mobile lighthouse all up and down the coast of the United States in the 1900s. And they were stationed at Blunt's Reef off the coast there in Mendocino. And although Cape Mendocino Lighthouse was in full operation, a lightship was stationed beginning in 1905 and into the 1950s. Swift Shore was present on the fateful day of June 15, 1916, when the steamer Bear, carrying a crew and passengers, ran aground at Bear River, and the ship crew and passengers attempted to come ashore with lifeboats, but with the heavy surf, the boats capsized and 5 people drowned. Those still aboard the Bear jumped in the remaining lifeboats and rowed out to the Swift Shore lightship for safety, in which 155 people sought temporary refuge. Without the lightship, the passengers and crew would have most likely drowned. It would have ended in one more Humboldt County tragic maritime disaster. So I talked a little bit about the dwellings. They really built beautiful structures back then, Victorian, I mean, just gorgeous houses. But because of the unstable ground and the earthquakes that happened right off the triple junction, like we know, the original dwellings became uninhabitable, and they eventually had to be razed. For many years, the lighthouse keepers had to live in the oil house, breathing in the fumes of kerosene, with dangerous and unhealthy, like I mentioned before. And then 2 new dwellings were built in 1908 that were similar to those at Punta Gorda and Point Cabrillo. And these buildings, this is it right here, this photo of it. The buildings were the highest lighthouse keepers dwellings in the United States, at 422 feet above the ocean. So that was kind of a neat fact I came about. One of the most interesting, so I researched a lot of the lighthouse keepers, and one of them was Archibald Marble. So he was out at Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse. He was here. He was an interesting man. He was at Cape Mendocino. Like I said, it was the Alcatraz of lighthouses. This is where they kind of just put all the ne'er-do-wells, or the ones that didn't quite fit in the lighthouse keepers service. They're very polished individuals, but Captain Archibald Philander Marble was not. He was a native in New York, and just a little bit about him. This might be him on the signal station in Camp Mendocino. I'm not sure, but it's definitely when he was there. He was a member of the U.S. Infantry in 1853 and helped build the fort at Bucksport, Fort Humboldt, under the direction of Quartermaster Grant. So he saw a lot of history. He became the Humboldt Harbor lighthouse keeper from 1869 to 1874. So he was there quite a few times, but during that tenure, he was accused of being drunk and not attending to his duties, with no visible light on occasions. He then was transferred and promoted to remote Cape Mendocino Lighthouse from 1874 to 1891. And there was a signal station there. It was during this time in 1881 that he and his assistant spent the week sprucing up the lighthouse for the inspector to arrive. He arrived by ship from San Francisco and crashed in the surf below, where he soon drowned. So that's how I started sort of researching. I had found out that this inspector had drowned, and I was like, who's the lighthouse keeper during this time? I mean, that was a crazy time for him, where the inspector's coming and they're getting everything ready, and then he drowns below. And then I found this whole story about Archibald and how he'd been married 4 times and hauled into court, actually, for not lighting the light at Humboldt Harbor. He was married 4 times, like I said, once for a few days. He had 8 children, and he was accused of drunken disregard of his duties many times. Newspaper clippings and legal documents paint a portrait of a scurrilous lighthouse keeper of the wild coast of the Pacific Northwest. He died in 1901 and is buried at Myrtle Grove Cemetery in Eureka. Mary Marble was the second lighthouse keeper at Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse in 1874. So she actually was his assistant when he was there. So I thought that was interesting. So part of the book was really the fascinating tidbits that I would find out about the lighthouse keepers and sort of what was going on back then. That's why I love history so much. So in 1948, the lighthouse was automated and with a beacon, and the original lens was loaned to the city of Ferndale, Cape Mendocino. For many years, Humboldt County fair attendants would speak of the 16 beams of light upon entering and exiting the week-long summer fair event. In 2008, 60 years after it was moved from Cape Mendocino, the Coast Guard assessed the lens condition and found that it was in continued deterioration due to the lack of controlled environment. And so they pulled the lens, and it was removed from the replica lighthouse in September of 2012 and placed in storage at the fairgrounds. And that's where it's at. In 1960, all the buildings, powerhouses, and dwellings and oil house and shed went up for auction, with the contingency of moving the buildings. And it had been a decade since the last keepers left the lighthouse, and the buildings were in poor condition with squatters living in them. And they moved and they burnt all the buildings, unfortunately, and pushed the remnants off the cliff. And that is what is there now. So it's an automated light. And I want to give some kudos here to the Cape Mendocino Lighthouse Preservation Society, because if it wasn't for them, Humboldt County and the BLM and a lot of other folks, this would not be at Malcolm's Park in Shelter Cove. They completely restored it. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story here. With multiple agencies, just like I mentioned, the volunteers took apart the lower levels, unbolted 129 years of rusted pieces, and shipped them to Whitethorn Construction, where they were sandblasted and repainted. In 1998, the National Guard airlifted the lantern to Shelter Cove at Point Delgada and Malcolm's Park, and it was reassembled, restored, and fitted by new glass. So amazing work by the Mendocino Preservation Society. So I just really wanted to give you guys kudos for that. All right, so we're running out of time a little bit. Is there a time limit here? I have a couple more. I have Trinidad Lighthouse and then
That's
Punta
fine.
Gorda. Okay, so I've got about 15 more slides.
Sounds good.
There's a lot of stuff here. So Trinidad Lighthouse Station was probably the nicest lighthouse station to be a lighthouse keeper, I would say, when I studied all of them. To date, the Trinidad Lighthouse has the oldest California fog bell structure, and that's pictured on the right. And you can still see that, and it's still in operation. It's all automated. The station was without a fog signal for its first 26 years, which meant the Lighthouse Board assigned a sole lighthouse keeper. And in 1898, a 4,000-pound bronze fog belt arrived and was installed on this cliff here. And it was much like a winding clock. And so the lighthouse keeper actually had to run down these steps from the light where the lighthouse, this was their dwelling, this beautiful Victorian house here. Fred Harrington had moved here with his wife, and he had to run down these steps and then wind it so that it would sound every 10 seconds. And then one time he actually was winding the mechanisms, and then it fell over the cliff somehow and into the ocean. So it's probably still down there somewhere. So Fred came, he was a prison guard at San Quentin. A lot of these men were actually Civil War veterans and then became prison guards or worked somewhere in the military as veterans and then became lighthouse keepers because it was a nice transition. Sorry. So he documented one of the largest waves that actually hit the light itself and actually put the light out. And it was a 200-foot wave that shook the lighthouse with such force, it put the light out. And that was December 31st, 2013. And we had a dedication, and I did some living history on that day. So he may have documented the largest wave in Humboldt County history. He said, I was in the tower and had just set the lens in operation, turned to wipe the lantern windows when I observed a sea of unusual height. Then about 200 yards distance approaching it, I watched it as it came in. And when it struck the bluff, the jar was heavy and the sea shot up the face of the bluff and over it until the solid sea seemed to be on a level with where I stood and the lantern, 196 feet above mean high water. And a lot of people will say, well, was there a tsunami or something? Nope. It was a really, really intense storm that they were involved in back in 1913. So Fred Harrington also saw the Great White Fleet in 1908, which was during World War I. It was to show the world that we had this great Navy fleet, an effort to show off our wares, our military wares. In 1961, they removed the lighthouse dwelling and put up these barracks, unfortunately. Not as pretty. And then they removed the barracks in 2000, and we have what we have now. It's beautiful overlook. And we opened the lighthouse with the Trinidad Museum Society, which is our partners, from 10 to 12 on the first Saturday of every month. And that's me kind of dressed in costume with some great friends, Peg Wheeler and her husband. Also up there is the cross that was erected by the Women's Club in 1913 to replace what in the Trinidad Museum, what was the original wooden cross that they've discovered that was erected by the Spanish in 1775. So that was kind of an interesting thing on the Trinidad head there. Now we can get to Punta Gorda Light Station, 1912. We have the lighthouse keepers there. So the fourth order Fresnel lens was lit. Inside the lens was an incandescent oil vapor lamp with a 4th order lens and a focal plane 75 feet above mean high tide. It was visible for 14 nautical miles. An electric lamp came into use in the 1940s, only a few years before the light was permanently extinguished. So it was also automated for a short time. And this was recently restored too with Great American Outdoors money. So, Punta Gorda was really erected because of the St. Paul shipwreck in 1905. So there was multiple shipwrecks between 1895 and 1907. 10 ships met their end, including the St. Paul in 1905, and the tricolor pictured right. Lighthouse funding was appropriated much like traffic lights, like I said, when serious accidents occurred. In 1907, the steamer Columbia was heading north from San Francisco to Portland when it collided with the lumber ship San Pedro, and 77 people drowned. 1 year later, in 1908, the incident, along with others, motivated Congress to approve $60,000 to build the Punta Gorda Lighthouse and a lot of these dwellings. It was labeled the Lost Coast. Punta Gorda Lighthouse Station was the most remote lighthouse station along the California coast. It was coined the Alcatraz of lighthouses, just like Cape Mendocino, but it was where the foul balls, quote unquote, were stationed there, and the guys who had goofed off. But I don't believe that. I think these guys had their stuff together for sure. Supplies arrived via steam schooner off the coast of 4 Mile Creek and were dragged by horses and mules to the site. Several buildings were constructed on a level bench just above the high water mark, which included a fog signal building, concrete oil house, blacksmith, carpenter shop, 3 2-story wood frame keepers' houses, and a barn. All but the fog signal and lighthouse were identical to Point Cabrillo Lighthouse. So they didn't, what was working, they didn't mess with it. They just replicated it, made it look like that. I can imagine what it was like. In November, they would button themselves up pretty much for the winter and not even go out for supplies. So they would make sure to get everything they needed for the winter, and then they would go back around spring just because of the creek, the 4 Mile Creek, and, as you can imagine. So the lighthouse staff during the 1920s and 30s were not only hard workers, but creative. They were the only keepers in the country to double the fog signal station as an art gallery. Inside the signal station, visitors could see the fog signal compressor pictured right, and all the impressive shiny brass tools and all the impressive lens cleaning materials, oil cans, and pitchers. This space was a visual experience amidst the backdrop of the keepers' landscape paintings that hung on the wall. So many of the keepers were artists. Unfortunately, much of the art was solely seen by the staff, and working at the lighthouse proved to be an isolating experience. Eventually, a phone line was put in with steel beams embedded along Windy Point. So good kudos to Southern Humboldt being creative and making your space. Even in isolated areas, you guys have lots of fun turning a fog signal station into an art gallery. That's awesome. So this photograph, oh gosh, I don't have the name of this person, but it's just an amazing photograph that was done when it was sort of in this ghost town period after the keepers, of course, had left. Just with the storm behind the building and the picket fence and everything going, just looks so much like a ghost town there. So unfortunately, in 1970, there was many squatters that were living in these buildings, and to a lot of dismay and a lot of uprising, people were not happy with the BLM. The BLM had to burn all these buildings, and they were in such bad repair that they weren't able to repair them at that time. and they were burned. So Punta Gorda, this is the end of my slideshow. The BLM is dedicated to preserving the history and structural integrity of the lighthouse and the oil house. And we were able to get some money from, both the structures were nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. And in 2021, the BLM received Great American Outdoors Acts funds. Is Cheryl on the call? Is she able to unmute herself? She's our archaeologist. I wanted to hand it over to her to talk a little bit about the lantern and the restoring. This is the after photo. As you can see, there was a lot of the work done. It's just gorgeous out there. Are you on, Cheryl?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks, Julie. This has been a great presentation. Yeah, like Julie said, the lighthouse and the oil house were placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976. And so we've had a responsibility to try and maintain them exactly the way they looked in 1976, ever since. And so in 2017, we realized that both structures needed some work, and we started planning. It's kind of challenging because there are lots of laws and regulations to be followed. Not only do we have to follow the National Secretary of Interior guidelines for historic preservation, but these structures sit just within the wilderness boundary at King Range. And then also there are protected marine mammals that now inhabit the beach there. They moved in several years ago. And so we have to really think about any disturbances to them. So yeah, thanks to the Great American Outdoors Act, we were able to get some funding. A lot of planning went into this. And then last year, we were able to contract out the work for the lighthouse. And then this summer, we will be working on the oil house. So basically the work that they did is they filled in a lot of the cracks on the lighthouse. They removed all of the paint from the concrete in the tower structure. They replaced the interior stairway, the circular stairway. They replaced the railing that goes around the tower. They put a new lightning rod back on the top of the tower. So I don't know, I hope some of you on the call tonight have been able to get out there since we did the work. So, and I'll just end there. If anybody has any questions, I'll try and answer them if Julie can't.
Yeah. Here's my contact information. I wanted to say a special thanks to Trinidad Museum Society, who we partner with, Humboldt County Historical Society, which I did a lot of research, and Humboldt State, which is now Cal Poly Photo Collection. It's a great resource. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Julie. And it was an excellent presentation, fascinating. Thank you, Cheryl, for sharing a little bit about the restoration of Punta Gorda Lighthouse. It looks great. I haven't been out there yet, but I'm looking forward to getting out there and checking it out in person. So now we're at the point of the lecture where we're going to open it up to a Q&A. We did allow folks to turn on their video cameras and unmute themselves. So if anybody's interested to show their face or let us hear your voice and ask a question, we would welcome that. I see a few things coming into the chat, so that's a good way to share your questions too, if you don't want to turn on your camera or ask an actual question with your voice. But I guess in terms of, starting with the questions, I know that you mentioned, Julie, that, once they found a certain style for the lighthouses, that they kind of took that template and ran with it. And I noticed that there's some similarities in styles between, some of the different lighthouses locally. And I'm wondering, how they elected certain styles for certain locations. Like, for instance, I noticed that the Trinidad Lighthouse and Punta Gorda both have that squared off kind of look. And then I look at Cape Mendocino and it seems a totally different style altogether. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it might be dependent on its location. So I know the Trinidad lighthouse is 25 feet, the tower itself, and it's based on the fact that it's all concrete too. It's really solid. They just built it so incredibly with the materials that they had, as probably as cheaply as they could, but it was stout and short because it was on a 200-foot cliff. So I mean that probably has something to do with the design as well. Cape Mendocino was also very high up. And so it was shorter and squatter probably than, comparatively to Humboldt Harbor Lighthouse, which, the tower had to get a little higher just because it was so low to the ground and it wasn't on a cliff. So I think that probably had something to do with it. And then the designer, architect hired by the Lighthouse Board, Amy B. Young, who was the initial person to really design all the lighthouses. I think there was 8 or 11 of them on California coast. Decided that, it just made more sense to have the living space all in one building, and then the tower itself going through the center of it. So that was kind of a smart design. But yeah, interesting. They were all built with just heavy concrete and designed to really, be able to withstand our weather, our winds, and our seismic activity.
And with Cape Mendocino, that seems unique, at least locally. Is that a style that was employed elsewhere along the California coast or West Coast?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. No.
Okay. I've got one more question before we see if anyone else here wants to join in, and that is about, out of Punta Gorda, we see that there's debris from a shipwreck, and do we know which of the wrecks? Is that the St. Paul shipwreck that we see that debris at Punta Gorda, or is that
Or
more-
tricolor? I mean, there was several just right off the coast there. So is there something that's just recently washed up?
Not recently, but there's debris that seems like it's been there, for
Oh,
decades, and I wondered if we knew which shipwreck that particular debris.
oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't seen that. I know in in the bar going into the Columbia Gorge area, there's a lot of shipwrecks that you can see. That was also a really dangerous port and bar right there, where a lot of shipwrecks happened going into the Columbia River, Cape Disappointment. But yeah, I haven't seen the wreckage. I'll have to go look better when I'm out at Punta Gorda.
Yeah, it's a little south of there, I believe.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So
I've
we
been
gotta-
there, but
Yeah, it's right on the beach, so it's a pretty prominent.
I must
feature,
have
so
walked
you'll
right
see.
past it. Yeah.
So we did get a question in the chat, and that was what was the source of light in the mid 1850s?
Oh, before the Fresnel lens, it was a reflector, sort of like a reflector metal concave structure. I showed a little picture of it in the slideshow, but
And was it a candle or a oil?
yeah,
lamp?
it was like a candle or a kerosene lamp, so it wasn't a lot. And then before that, I mean, before the lighthouses, they would just use big bonfires, and then just keep them going for the ships that were coming in the harbors. So yeah, they progressed to the Fresnel lens after the Department of Treasury took over, but before that, it was a reflector lens.
Interesting. So somebody chimed in with feedback about my question about the debris near Punta Gorda, and they said the boilers on the beach are from either the Columbia or St. Paul.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, pretty neat. So were there other questions out there? It looked like somebody might have turned on their camera for a minute and had a question for Julie or Cheryl. Any more questions out there? Put them in the chat if so. Otherwise, we're nearing the end of our Q&A. So Last chance for anybody. Okay, somebody chimed in. This is Cheryl Kinnear Ferris says one item of debris has a date of late 1800s that can be seen at low tide. The metal buoy washed away in recent storms. So that's interesting. We have another question here. What are the chances of having the Cape Mendocino lens return to Shelter Cove?
That I don't know. So like I said, it's yeah, it's all up to the Coast Guard on
Is
that
that
one.
in Ferndale or is that somewhere else? The lens.
Yeah, the
itself?
Cape Mendocino lens is in Ferndale, so it's in storage, I believe, at either the Historical Society. I think it's at the Ferndale Historical Society, and I don't know. They're pretty attached to it for their fairgrounds, so.
Yeah. Another question was, what is the status of the Punta Gorda lens?
You know, I don't know where that is, actually. I don't know where that lens is, to be honest with you.
On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.